Now, for those of you that don't know what a guestbook is basically an area on your website that allows your users to post something about the experience they've had with their website, and so on and so forth. Now, you don't have to strictly use this as a guestbook. You could adapt it and create it to suit your needs depending on your skill level in PHP. You may want to create this into somewhat of a shout box, or include it somewhere in your website that users can post messages. Either way, it's a simple PHP application, if you like, that's basically going to allow us to post a name, an email address and a message, and it's going to appear here. You can see at the moment we've got no entries yet. This is because there's no entries exist in our database. Okay, so if you're beginning at PHP, if you haven't looked at databases already, this is a really good tutorial to follow, because we're going to be looking in depth at inserting data and taking data out of a database so we can display it onto our page. So I'm just going to give you a quick demo of the program, and you can see, or the application, and you can see how it runs and how it works. Now you can see at the moment we've got fields here. We're storing fields inside of our database. So we've got ID, timestamp, name, email and message. Now the two that we're not using user submitted data for is ID, which is going to auto increment, you can see over here, every time we insert a new value. Now the reason we do this is because we like to keep a unique number for each record in our database, or each row in our database, and this just means that we can easily access values if we or rows if we like by this single value. We can also order by ID, but in this case we're going to be ordering by this value here called timestamp, and a timestamp is basically a long number of digits, and this is the amount of seconds from a specific time, and this represents the current date, and we can use the date function in PHP to manipulate this, but I won't go into that too much now. You'll see that a bit later on in the tutorial. And then we've got name, email, message. These are pretty standard values that we have here, here and here. So we've got values for these as well. Name 25 characters, so it should be enough. Email 255, which is a maximum amount of valid characters for an email address, I believe. It might be 254, I think, but you know, I'll leave you to research that. But you can always put this something lower if you don't want your users to be submitting email addresses that are too long, perhaps, because this is quite long. And the message, I'm saying 255 as well, because I don't want the user to submit too much information. And we're going to include checks in this inside of our script. We're also going to include a max length attribute in our HTML form here as well. So inside here, we're not going to be able to submit more than 25 characters. In here, we're not going to be able to submit more than 255 and 255 here. And we're also going to include that check in PHP as well. So let's go ahead. There's no data in here at the moment, therefore we are returning no entries yet here, this message here. Let's go ahead and just enter some information. Okay, so I've entered a name, an email address and a short message. Let's go ahead and click post. Okay, so you can see that we now have this posted by Alex, the email address here in brackets, and then on, and then it's giving us the date and the time that this has posted, and this is using a timestamp value. So we'll have a look at that in its raw form inside the database in a moment, and then we just have the message here. So let's go ahead and post another one. Okay, so again I've entered a name, an email address and a message, click post, and you can see that this just structures these above each other. And you've noticed that the newest is at the top, so the newest entry is at the top, and we're going to do that in our SQL query a bit later. Let's go ahead in the database and click on browse, and we'll be able to see these values inside the database. So you can see at the moment I've got ID of 9 and 10. These usually start at, well, these always will start at 1 when you're creating your table for the first time, but because I've already played around with this beforehand, obviously I've already entered some data in. So this will basically increment every time. So we've got 9, 10, and we can reset this back to 1, which when we recreate our table, you'll see it will start at 1. And you can see here the timestamp in its numerical form. and that represents the current date and time. You can see that this is 34 and 8 seconds, and this is 34 and 42 seconds. So we'll be transforming this value to a date of it later on. And then we've got the name, email and message, nothing special there. You can see it, it's plain text, and it's output onto the page here. So with all that said, this is how the guestbook works. We're also going to be including relevant security checks and ensuring, like I said earlier, that the user doesn't post too much data to the page. So let's go ahead over to our text editor and we'll start programming this out. Okay, so we're over to our text editor. The first thing we actually need to do is connect to our database. Now, if you've already looked at connecting to your database, you'll know that we're going to need to supply the server name, or connect to the MySQL server rather. We're going to need to specify a server name, a username and a password, and then the database name itself. Now in my case these are unique to me, so my database credentials, if we just come back to our home in PHP My Admin, if we click on privileges here, you can see that I've got root and no password. So we're connecting to localhost with the username root, and we're not specifying a password. Obviously this is insecure in a real life application, but because this is just on my local computer, my localhost server on my computer, then there's no need for a password really. But obviously if you were using a paid for server where people could actually access it, then obviously it's a good idea to use a password. Okay, so we're going to be using these credentials to connect, and the database is just going to be called Guestbook. So I've already created the database here, and we're ready to create tables on here. To create a database, you're just going to simply type the value in here and click create. You'll be presented with this next screen here, and then we can go ahead and create our table.